The air on Pietas Tertius tasted of a lie. That was the truth that settled in the back of my throat, sharp and metallic, long before the landing ramp had fully hissed down. It wasn't the ozone or the sterile tang of our ship's filters. It was the world's own signature, unbearably clean, cold, and saturated with the cloying sweetness of manufactured piety. It was the air of a tomb polished to perfection, and breathing it felt like inhaling dust from a saint's desiccated bones. A purity purchased with something hideous, Lyra, I heard myself whisper. The sound was flat and dry, swallowed by the humming silence of the landing bay. Lyra, my interrogator, my sentinel, offered no physical response. But the faintest, almost imperceptible shift in the angle of her helm was her reply. She understood. After decades serving the Ordo Hereticus, we knew that the greatest lies in the Imperium weren't shouted by cultists. They were whispered through the immaculate stone of cathedrals. My purpose here was simple, yet it weighed on me like a suit of flak armor forged from guilt. The Administratum flagged a single rhythmic energy spike. A thump, thump, thump on the deep vaulted data streams. A heartbeat in the cold equations of imperial bureaucracy. My job was to silence it. Not just the noise, but the truth it represented. I descended the ramp. The cacophony of the welcoming crowds was muted by the dampeners, sounding like a million souls grinding their teeth in unison. But the dread was immediate and total. This planet's faith, spread across the gleaming white marble under my boots, felt brittle and cold. It was less devotion and more a collective psychic iron cage, and I was tasked with ensuring the cage held. The local dignitary, Governor Regent Tarsius, broke his perfect line to approach. His smile, fixed high on a pale, jowled face, was a grotesque, unnatural thing. It didn't reach his eyes. It didn't even reach his skin. It was glued on with sheer, desperate willpower. Lord Inquisitor Var, he boomed, a theatrical tremor of gratitude in his voice. Welcome to Pietas Tertius. You find us in a state of unblemished sanctity. I raised my hand, the gesture heavy with the authority of the Inquisition, and stopped the cascade of lies. I didn't need to speak to convey my judgment. My silence was a vacuum, sucking the zealous air out of his lungs. Governor, I stated, my voice dangerously soft. The schedule is cancelled. We proceed immediately to the source of the anomaly, the Reliquary Vault. In that second, the mask shattered. His eyes swam with confusion, then panic, before the trained obedience slammed back down. The vault. It requires preparation, Lord Inquisitor. Preparation. That single word confirmed everything. Preparation meant cleaning up the ugly truth before the Inquisition could see it. I walked past him, my boot soles clicking sharply on the polished marble floor. I was moving toward the shadow of the Cathedral of the Divine Ascent, a colossal, arrogant structure that hid a secret terrible enough to justify its own existence. Lyra, I ordered, my voice dropping back to the dry rasp of shared exhaustion. Assume point. We need to descend and we need to be silent. I need to know what kind of heresy necessitates a heartbeat to keep the lights on. I felt the immense, unbearable weight of Imperial survival settle on my shoulders. I knew, with the certainty of a man long dead inside, that whatever suffering I was about to uncover, I would ultimately be forced to endorse it. Because in the age of the Imperium, some truths are simply too catastrophic to be unmasked. I had come here to confirm a flaw, but I was leaving knowing I would have to become part of it. The lie was necessary, and that necessity was the true horror. I dismissed the Governor-Regent with a flick of my wrist, a gesture that conveyed both imperial authority and profound disgust. He sputtered, an undignified sound that was instantly smothered by the rush of his aides, who absorbed him into a frantic huddle of polished lace and panic. Lyra moved ahead of me, her black ceramite form a sharp blade cutting through the crowd. Her silence was a palpable challenge to the pious atmosphere. Where the local zealots offered hymns, Lyra offered only the cold, unblinking surveillance of the machine god. Our target was the cathedral's administrative wing, where the local head of the ecclesiarchy resided. We found him not in a grand audience hall, but in a small, intensely private chamber reeking of aged, expensive incense and polished silver. Cardinal Xantus was an old man, thin and rigid in robes of unbleached wool. His hands, clasped together on the desk, were skeletal but steady. Unlike the governor, whose zeal was a cheap veneer, Xantus's devotion was a terrifying, calcified presence. It filled the room cold and utterly immovable. "Lord Inquisitor," the cardinal acknowledged, his voice dry as parchment. He offered no welcome, no deference, only a flat recognition of my authority. "You come seeking a minor lapse in protocol. The relic is secure." The data spike was an atmospheric fluctuation, corrected minutes after it was recorded. "An atmospheric fluctuation," I repeated, letting the absurdity settle. "That required the attention of the Ordo Hereticus." "The Holy Terran Administratum is zealous in its vigilance," Xantus said, his eyes perfectly steady. And that was the second thing that chilled me more than the air. His eyes were too glazed. They were a pale, unremarkable gray, but the pupils seemed unnaturally dilated, unfocused, as if staring past me and into some terrible, luminous truth only he could perceive. It was the look of a mind perpetually held in ecstatic thrall, a zealot's high that never faded. I stepped closer to the desk, forcing him to track my movement. The anomaly was described as rhythmic, Cardinal, a pulse. "Is the Administratum now logging the pulse of the Imperial Creed?" The corners of Xantus's mouth twitched, the closest he came to expressing displeasure. "Such language suggests organic life, Inquisitor, a repulsive notion in a vault dedicated to the sacred purity of faith." "I am trained to look past sanctity, Cardinal, and straight into potential heresy," I countered. "The Reliquary's lock mechanisms. I require immediate access codes and the schematic for the sub-levels." He ignored the request and instead launched into a quiet, chilling monologue about the sanctity of the Reliquary's contents, a purported piece of the Emperor's own armor worn during the Unification Wars. His words were a wall of high Gothic rhetoric, calculated to delay and intimidate. I glanced at Lyra. Her optical lens was trained not on the Cardinal, but on a small, heavy devotional urn on the corner of the desk, tracing the complex unseen runes carved into its base. It was my silent command: find the path of least resistance. In the midst of the Cardinal's sermon, Lyra moved. She did not speak or even alter her stance. Her hand, a multi-jointed implement of polished steel and cable, snapped out with impossible speed, snatching the devotional urn off the desk. Xantus broke off mid-sentence, his glazed eyes finally focusing, burning with pure, instantaneous rage. "Inquisitor!" "That is a relic of the highest order." I simply let my gaze meet his, holding the fury at bay. "It is an object, Cardinal, and your sudden anger suggests it is a necessary object." Lyra, with her back still to the Cardinal, had already connected a thin fiber-optic cable from her gauntlet into the base of the urn. The surface of the urn contained the encrypted administrative key to the lower levels, hidden in plain sight. In a matter of seconds, her systems bypassed the security protocol, the data streaming silently back to my helm display. "The preparation period is over, Cardinal," I stated, retrieving the urn from Lyra and setting it back on the desk. "We have the schematic. You may resume your sermon." Cardinal Xantus did not move, did not speak. He simply watched us, his eyes regaining that terrifying, unblinking glaze. He made no further attempt to physically stop us, but his psychic presence, the rigid, icy wall of his conviction, followed us to the door. I knew then that the governor's panic was merely fear of failure. The Cardinal's rigid silence, however, was born of something far worse: the fear of discovery. He wasn't hiding a crime. He was guarding a necessary secret that was about to be undone by the simple logic of my inquiry. The clean, cold air of piety was about to be peeled back, revealing the terrible organic rot beneath. We left the sanctified, scented air of the Cardinal's chamber and began our descent. The transition from the public face of the Ministorum to its hidden infrastructure was immediate and jarring. The initial levels were still impeccably finished. We moved through vast, vaulted maintenance corridors, paved with the same blindingly white marble as the surface. But here, the marble was silent. The endless hymns and prayers that constantly echoed above us simply vanished, absorbed by the sheer, unfeeling mass of the stone. It was a stillness so profound it felt like a pressure against my eardrums, a lack of noise where, logically, the reverberations of millions of chanting feet should have been a constant roar. The damping is unnatural, I observed to Lyra, the whisper barely audible over the click of her segmented joints. Lyra responded by tapping a quick series of commands into her gauntlet, running a dampening counter-frequency scan. Her silence was always useful. It forced me to rely on my own senses, and here, they were screaming alarm. The air, though still unnaturally cold, was growing heavier. It carried the faint, earthy scent of ancient masonry and something else, a clean, coppery smell that reminded me less of blood and more of old, preserved iron. We followed the schematics Lyra had extracted from the devotional urn. The path twisted downward, bypassing utility hubs and automated sanitation ducts designed to maintain the surface's unblemished sanctity. With every turn, the architecture devolved. The ornate carved marble gave way to rough-hewn, unpolished stone. The arches grew heavy and squat, designed for brute structural support rather than divine aesthetic. It was in these deeper levels that the true dissonance began. The stillness remained absolute. The cold intensified, piercing the layers of my protective clothing. I extended my senses, searching for the reason for this overwhelming calm. There were no chittering servitors, no muffled crew chatter, none of the constant, frantic activity that should characterize the support structure of a world-spanning cathedral. It was an impossible engineered silence. We passed the first of the guards. They were static sentinels of the Ministorum Guard, standing watch over cross junctions. They weren't the eager zealots from the landing pad. These were old men, veterans given a ceremonial duty. They wore heavy, tarnished silver armor and carried ceremonial halberds, but their eyes, visible in the dim emergency lighting, were utterly vacant. I paused, Lyra immediately taking a defensive stance. I moved to the nearest guard, my boots shuffling on the dust-caked floor. "Sentinel," I commanded, my voice flat. "Report." The man did not move. His gaze was fixed on a point far above us. I reached out and touched his gloved hand. It was cold, rigid, and slightly damp. As I pulled my hand back, I noticed the faintest tremor running through his body, a constant, minute vibration that was the only break in his absolute stillness. He was trembling at attention. "They're not merely vigilant, Lyra," I whispered. "They are paralyzed." Lyra's lens focused its attention past the guard and onto the floor. I followed her gaze. There, partially obscured by fine dust, was the next thread of the anomaly. Faint, dark, oily stains marred the rough stone floor around the sentinel's position. They were perfectly circular, about the size of a dinner plate, and had soaked deep into the porous stone. The revelation was chilling. The rhythmic pulse recorded in the data was likely connected to the immense containment mechanism of the Reliquary. The stillness of the guard, the coldness of the air, the silence. It was all a result of the same unnaturally powerful energy sink. The guard wasn't standing still by discipline. He was being psychically stabilized by whatever was in the vault, forcing every molecule in the sub-levels to remain unnaturally static to protect the experiment. "They are the perimeter," I concluded, moving quickly toward the final access point. "And they are suffering for it. Their fear, their despair, it's being harvested to feed the silence." The air here was no longer too clean. It was oppressive. The whispering marble was trying to tell me something, and now I knew what it was. The silence was the sound of a million things not happening. And somewhere, deep beneath us, a single regular thump was forcing that silence into existence. We had reached a final, massive bulkhead, the vault door. I glanced at Lyra. "The lie ends here. Prepare to breach the integrity protocols. We are going to find out what kind of silence requires a heartbeat to sustain it." The final approach to the Reliquary vault was a tunnel of unadorned granite, hewn roughly from the bedrock of Pietas Tertius. It felt primal and cold, a stark contradiction to the polished sanctity of the cathedral miles above. We navigated the last 20 meters in absolute silence. Lyra's heavy, segmented boots designed to suppress ground resonance made no sound at all. My own steps were careful, focused on absorbing every ambient detail that the governor and cardinal had hoped to conceal. The passage ended in a flat, circular chamber dominated entirely by the vault door. It was colossal, a masterpiece of Imperial engineering forged from layers of adamantium and ceramite, reinforced with black iron rivets the size of my fist. It didn't have a simple wheel lock. Instead, the mechanism was complex and ritualistic, covered in brass prayer plates and requiring multiple cipher keys and biometric signatures to turn. It was designed to resist not just thieves, but the warp itself. And standing guard over this testament to Imperial paranoia were two more sentinels. They were copies of the last, old, vacant-eyed, and locked in a terrifying state of motionless vigilance. They stood on opposing sides of the chamber, their ceremonial halberds held at an unnaturally rigid salute. I could still detect the faintest tremor running through their aging bodies, a constant vibration that suggested their internal fear was being physically suppressed. They were living capacitors, holding a charge of stability for the reliquary within. I moved to inspect the immediate perimeter. The energy radiating from the vault was intense, a palpable pressure that felt like standing on a submerged ship hull, quiet, cold, and immensely weighty. Lyra's optical lens was trained on the lock mechanism, quietly mapping its sequence with invisible laser pulses. The process is unnecessarily complex, I observed, keeping my voice low. It requires ritualistic access, not merely mechanical. The lock sequence, now displayed on my helm-mounted Auspex via Lyra's feed, demanded a pattern of ceremonial key insertions linked to a liturgical calendar. It was designed to ensure that the user was not only authorized, but in a state of ritualistic purity and belief. It was an access key forged from faith itself. My eyes swept the floor again. The granite was dull and rough, but around the positions of the two guards, the same telltale anomalies were present. The small circular oily stains were repeated on the floor beneath their boots. They were faint and dark, having soaked into the porous stone but undeniable. I crouched, tracing the edge of one stain with a gloved finger. It wasn't simple lubricant or motor oil. It possessed a strange, subtle scent, like dried marrow mixed with machine fluid. The stain was clearly emanating from the guard's position, perhaps leaking from the specialized boots or some unseen stabilizing equipment they wore. "Lyra," I murmured, "scan the origin point of the staining. Run a density analysis against human neural matter and calcified tissue." The immediate assumption was that the stains were effluent from the guard's stabilization harness, a necessary expense of keeping them perfectly still. But the composition felt unnervingly deliberate, as Lyra's optical system whirred, focusing its energy on the floor. The rhythmic energy pulse, the heartbeat, suddenly spiked, slamming a raw wave of psychic pressure against my mind. It was momentary, violent, and immediately contained by the vault's massive structure. The pressure subsided, leaving the air humming faintly. The two guards, however, did not flinch. They remained rigidly fixed, their trembling momentarily intensifying before settling back into their unnerving, persistent hum. I stood slowly, the puzzle pieces clicking into a disturbing whole. The guards weren't just stabilizing the perimeter with their fear. They were somehow connected to the thing inside. The lock required faith, the environment required absolute stability, and the containment mechanism required constant, minute maintenance that produced this strange, organic effluent. The reliquary is not merely a vault for sacred objects, Lyra, I concluded, stepping back toward the center of the chamber. It is a machine, a mechanism that uses ritual and devotion as fuel. And we are about to see what it is preserving with such terrifying necessity. Lyra completed the ritualistic access sequence, triggering a deep, shuddering groan as the immense adamantium plates of the vault door began their slow, calculated retreat into the granite walls. The light that spilled out was not the soft gold of a relic chamber, but a stark, bone-white glow, cold and intense. We had reached the core of the anomaly. The vault door retracted fully with a final, heavy metallic shudder, exposing the chamber within. The bone-white light I had glimpsed was, in fact, the glow of the relic itself, amplified by the sterile white ceramite walls. The chamber was small, airtight, and aggressively clean. There was no dust, no grime, and no air of venerable antiquity. It felt like a surgical theater. And in the very center, dominating the space, was the Reliquary. It was a colossal, ornate box, far larger than any container necessary for a fragment of armor or a piece of sanctified bone. It stood nearly 3 meters high, forged entirely from what appeared to be bone-white marble and polished ivory, reinforced by brass filigree that writhed like trapped serpents. It was beautiful, sickeningly intricate, and impossibly immense. My immediate, visceral reaction was not reverence, but profound nausea. I stepped fully into the vault, Lyra taking a defensive position near the entrance, her systems already compensating for the psychic pressure. The air inside was colder than the tunnels outside, and yet it was vibrating with contained psychic stress. It wasn't the chaotic roar of the warp. It was a tight, controlled vibration, like a bowstring drawn too taut. I approached the reliquary slowly, my gaze sweeping its surface. It was indeed covered in Imperial and Ecclesiarchy script, thousands of tiny prayers and protective wards etched deep into the marble and ivory. But my Inquisitor's eye saw past the devotion. The wards weren't celebrating a relic. They were shackling a prison. Lyra, meanwhile, was already at work. She deployed a micro-drone that zipped silently toward the reliquary, initiating a spectral analysis of the energy field surrounding the box. As the drone began its passive scanning, the rhythmic energy pulse, the anomaly that had brought me across the void, became immediately, terrifyingly apparent. It wasn't a static charge. It was a rhythmic, dull thump that wasn't audible with my ears, but was perceived directly by my auspex and felt as a dull pressure in my skull. It was terrifyingly rhythmic. "The source is confirmed, Lyra," I stated, my voice barely above a whisper. "The data spike is real, continuous, and originates from within this box. It is not an atmospheric fluctuation. The box was radiating raw, contained power, but the rhythm was utterly biological, the tempo of a healthy human at rest." And as I stared at the dense white mass, the horrifying conclusion began to solidify. This box was not holding a fragmented piece of the Emperor's armor. It is holding something down, I concluded, stepping back and allowing Lyra's spectral analysis to continue. Something that is both immensely powerful and unnervingly alive. The wards weren't meant to keep a heretic out. They were meant to keep it in. The size of the reliquary, the extreme measures taken to ensure its silence, the zealous fear of the Cardinal, all pointed toward a single, horrific conclusion. This entire vault was a machine built around a core of perpetual biological output. Lyra's spectral analysis completed. The result flashed across my helm display, a complex map of interwoven energy fields. The box itself was emitting immense energy, but the rhythmic pulse was the primary source, buried deep within the core mass. I turned to Lyra, the absolute cold of the chamber seeming to match the terrible clarity of the moment. "The lie is bigger than we thought, Interrogator," I whispered. "This is not simple heresy. It is a controlled atrocity. We are going to open that box and find out what must suffer eternally to maintain the purity of this world." With the terrifying reality of the anomaly confirmed, a rhythmic, organic power source contained within a sterile machine, my focus turned from what it was to how it functioned. Lyra had deployed 2 more micro-drones, which were now silently charting the pressure fluctuations around the reliquary. I, meanwhile, moved in close to examine the ornate surface of the bone-white box. The reliquary was a masterpiece of profane art. Its entire surface was covered in meticulous Ecclesiarchy script and protective sigils, carved directly into the marble and ivory with the painful precision of a master artisan. This was the binding scrimshaw. I ran a gloved finger over the tiny etchings. The script was indeed devotional High Gothic, full of protective blessings and invocations of the Emperor's power. But the pattern was wrong. A protective relic requires wards to deflect outside corruption. These wards were laid out in a complex, overlapping grid designed to contain internal pressure. It was the difference between a shield and a lock. The pattern is inverted. "Lyra," I muttered, confirming my dark suspicion. "This is not deflection. This is suppression. It's a cage built from faith." The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the vault's temperature. The reliquary was not merely preserving a relic, as the Ministorum claimed. It was holding something down. The energy it contained was so powerful that it required the continuous, focused psychic will represented by this scrimshaw just to keep the lid on. I activated my portable forensic scanner, running it along the base of the reliquary. The scan confirmed a dense, powerful energy signature consistent with a psychic containment field. The field itself was being generated not by an independent power cell, but by the rhythmic pulse originating from within. The box was powering its own prison. I stepped back to take in the full, horrific scale of the deception. The zeal of the Cardinal, the unnaturally cold air, the trembling sentinels. It was all necessary to prevent the raw power inside from simply obliterating the entire cathedral. I realized then the truth was far more complex than simple heresy. If the reliquary held a demon or a massive warp-tainted artifact, the only sensible Imperial action would be an exterminatus. But this was controlled, stabilized, and meticulously maintained. This suggested sanctioned knowledge, a decision made generations ago to fight fire with fire. My gaze settled on the dense ivory material itself. It was far too pale, too dense, and possessed an unnerving texture that seemed to subtly resist the touch. "Lyra," I commanded, my voice strained. "Run a material analysis on the primary casing. I want a molecular breakdown of the bone-white medium." The drone zipped down, deploying a tiny microsampler. We stood in silence, punctuated only by the low hum of the psychic field and the phantom pressure of the rhythmic thump in my skull. A moment later, the results flashed on my helm display and I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. The marble wasn't marble. The ivory wasn't tusk. The dense bone-white substance forming the shell of the reliquary contained high concentrations of hydroxyapatite and specialized neurological proteins elements only found in one place. The reliquary was literally cased in human bone and calcified neural matter. The cage itself was constructed from the remains of the faithful. "This is not a containment field," I whispered, the cold air suddenly tasting vile. "It is a living sacrifice." My suspicion had just shifted from controlled atrocity to something far older, far darker, and infinitely more dangerous. I knew then that the contents would be horrifying, but the sheer effort of the binding, the dedication to this ritual, was the true terror. The terrible knowledge that the reliquary was bound in bone and calcified brain matter did two things. It confirmed the scale of the atrocity, and it focused my mind with lethal clarity. This was no mere heresy. It was a deeply sophisticated, functional horror. I directed Lyra to begin preparations for drilling a microbore sample of the casing. We needed absolute confirmation of the contents before proceeding to a full breach. As Lyra's tools hummed softly, calculating the minimal stress point, my senses honed in again on the vault's core anomaly. The psychic pressure was constant, but underneath it, and underneath the low hum of the containment field, was an unnerving sound I had only detected through the auspex previously. It was a faint, steady percussion. Thump, thump, thump. It was muffled, dull, and perfectly rhythmic, the sound of something heavy and soft striking a dense surface sealed away. It was the pulse that had brought me across the void, now audible to my naked ear only because of the vault's profound acoustic dampening. I moved away from Lyra's operation, placing my ear directly against the smooth, bone-white surface of the reliquary. The rhythmic percussion was undeniable. It was a biological tempo, relentless and steady, emanating from the heart of the structure. "Lyra, halt the drill," I ordered, my voice sharp. Modify the micro-auspex. I want a sonic and deep density scan of the interior. Use the percussion as the focal point. The interrogator paused instantly, her tools retracting with a soft hydraulic sigh. Her single lens swiveled, acknowledging the new priority. I could feel the subtle vibrations of the thump-thump through my fingers pressed against the cold, calcified casing. It was an appalling sensation, the mechanical cold of the vault surrounding the terrible, undeniable warmth of life. The realization that this enormous cage was built around a tiny, suffering, beating core was a horror of elegant engineering. The scan commenced. The micro-auspex projected a faint, complex beam deep into the reliquary's mass, creating a three-dimensional model on my helm display. The density readings immediately proved the reliquary was not hollow. It was almost entirely filled with a dense, non-metallic substance. The inner space was packed solid, but the composition was erratic. Thick, dense layers interspersed with pockets of fluid and softer material. And at the very, very center, perfectly suspended within the dense medium, was the source of the rhythmic percussion. The auspex model resolved the shape in terrifying detail. It was a mass, roughly the size and shape of a human fist, surrounded by a complex network of vessels and tendrils. And it was moving. It was a single, immense, perfectly preserved human heart, suspended in the biological mortar. The rhythmic thump was the sound of the heart's own contraction, strong and steady, striking the dense, semi-organic packing material that entombed it. I straightened up, pulling my hand away from the bone casing, my mind recoiling from the cold, clinical efficiency of the atrocity. This was the anomaly. Not a fluctuating energy source, but a biological machine dedicated to perpetual controlled suffering. It was the beating heart of the planet's darkest secret. The lie is structural, Lyra, I stated, the air tasting like ash. The object is alive. Prepare the spectral analysis of the heart itself. We need to know what kind of anguish it is generating that can stabilize a rift. The truth was laid bare on my helm display, a single human heart beating within a colossal box of bone and mortar. The horror was not in the contents, but in the clinical, perverse genius of its engineering. The heart is the oscillator, Lyra, I analyzed, staring at the 3D model generated by the micro-auspex. It provides the rhythmic biological pulse that stabilizes the containment field. But what is this mass? My attention moved from the living organ to the terrifying material that entombed it. The dense, non-metallic substance filled the reliquary entirely, packing tightly around the heart like concrete. It was responsible for the incredible weight and stillness of the vault environment. Lyra, with her unparalleled cybernetic interface, was running a deep spectroscopic analysis on the surrounding material. The initial findings confirmed my terrible suspicion from examining the casing. The mortar was not natural stone. The mass was a matrix of high concentrations of hydroxyapatite, the primary component of bone, fused with complex neurological proteins. The substance was a dense mortar of ground human bone and calcified neural matter, deliberately refined and packed around the heart. It was a functional cemetery. The reliquary was not simply holding a beating heart. It was a mausoleum where countless human remains had been pulverized and mixed into a single, cohesive, horrifying mass. The living mortar, I whispered, the name tasting vile in my mouth. It's not structural support, it's a conduit. I realized then the insidious efficiency of the design. The mortar, made of calcified neural matter, was acting as a specialized energy conduit, a giant distributed circuit board of pulverized organic matter. It amplified the heart's single, biological pulse, translating its simple, powerful rhythm into the colossal, pervasive psychic containment field that enveloped the entire sublevel. The silence, the cold, the trembling sentinels, all were side effects of this terrifying apparatus. The rhythmic thump, amplified by the neural mortar, was imposing absolute order on the surrounding reality to keep the containment field rigid. I directed Lyra to analyze the mortar's integrity, focusing on the specific points where the heart's vessels connected to the surrounding material. We needed to know how the heart was sustained and how the energy was drawn out. Lyra's auspex projected the new visualization, a complex network of tiny, almost invisible tubules and vessels snaked away from the heart and into the living mortar. They were less like blood vessels and more like copper wiring, drawing bioenergy and psychic anguish from the perpetually beating heart. The anguish is the power source, I concluded, the cold logic of the atrocity overwhelming. The heart is kept alive but only to suffer, and its suffering is channeled through the ground remains of the faithful, a chorus of agony that powers the shield. We were looking at the perfect, sanctioned horror, an atrocity designed to leverage the most powerful, sustainable source of psychic energy known, human despair and suffering, and contain it within a shrine of bone. I turned from the reliquary, my eyes scanning the sealed chamber once more. The massive container was designed to be inviolable, but any machine of this complexity required maintenance. And if it required maintenance, there had to be an access point, a flaw in the perfect system. Lyra, I commanded, my voice flat and final. Scan the base of the reliquary. Find the point where the sustaining fluid is introduced. Every terrible machine needs a feeder. My gaze was locked on the visual model of the reliquary's interior. A beating heart suspended in a matrix of pulverized bone. It was the absolute zenith of sanctioned imperial horror, an energy source so potent, so perfectly contained, it risked destabilizing the very foundation of my faith. The heart is the oscillator. The mortar is the circuit, I summarized, watching the visualization of the tiny vessels snaking from the beating heart into the bone matter. I realized the nature of the vessels leading from the organ. They were not for blood flow. They were for energy transmission. They acted as a sustaining circuit. They drew the raw psychic energy, the anguish generated by the heart's perpetual suffering, and channeled it into the neural mortar, which in turn broadcast the stabilizing containment field. But a circuit needs maintenance. A heart needs fuel. Lyra, focus the auspex on the exterior base of the reliquary, I commanded, moving to the massive box's base. I need to know how they replenish the heart's energy and nutrient solution without breaching the primary wards. Lyra's sensors, utilizing micro-frequency imaging, began to sweep the polished bone-white pedestal upon which the great box rested. The material here was impossibly dense, yet the scan revealed what my naked eye could not. Minute flaws in the perfect surface. They were tiny, almost invisible ports. Microscopic apertures spaced at ritually precise intervals around the base. They were self-sealing, designed to be imperceptible to even the most thorough inspection, merging perfectly with the calcified neural matter. The ports were too small for a human hand, too precise for a servitor's crude claw. They were the feeding tubes for the atrocity, suggesting a specialized, secretive maintenance crew. I moved to one of the ports, activating a chemical sniffer on my glove. The results were instantaneous and disturbing. The residual scent was complex, a rich nutrient fluid base, mixed with synthetic amino acids and a strong, localized signature of a psychoreactive agent designed to suppress decay and enhance neural output. It was a high-grade cocktail designed not merely to sustain life, but to maximize its suffering. The ports are the access points for the nutrient solution, I confirmed, and they are used often. This is not a relic for passive veneration, Lyra. It is a terrible living machine that requires constant feeding. I stepped back, surveying the silent, sterile chamber. The rhythmic thump felt louder now, more urgent. It was a clock ticking down to my moment of decision. The cardinal's perfect piety, the governor's unnatural smile, the paralyzed guards, they were all accessories to this silent, continuous act of sacrifice. This secrecy requires a maintenance crew, I murmured, checking the temporal data on the auspex. A crew that is specialized, dedicated, and small enough to evade notice. If they feed it constantly, they must return soon. I turned to Lyra, my voice flat with finality. We wait, Interrogator. Prepare for a silent ambush. We are going to meet the caretakers of Pietas Tertius's soul. The wait was an exercise in pure psychic rigidity. I retreated into a deep meditative state, locking down my consciousness to prevent any residual psychic energy from disturbing the vault's unsettling stability. Lyra, a paragon of mechanical patience, stood frozen, her segmented body fused with the shadows near the still open vault door. The only sound was the muffled, rhythmic thump-thump of the heart, pulsing through the bone casing and directly into the tense silence. An hour bled into the next. My temporal display counted the slow march of the minutes, a reminder that while the cosmos was eternal, the window for my intervention was narrow. Then, a flicker. Not a sound, but a minute shift in the ambient pressure, registered first by Lyra's hypersensitive augers and immediately relayed to my helm display. From a narrow, obscured ventilation duct near the floor, a section of the granite wall silently slid aside. No human could have squeezed through the aperture. And what emerged was not human. They were small, diminutive figures, perhaps half the height of a grown man. At first glance, I assumed them to be child servitors, but the motion was too delicate, too fluid. They were childlike servitors, or possibly mutated thralls. Their forms were disturbingly skeletal, clad in tattered, damp grey cloth, and they moved with the unnerving, purposeful silence of dolls wound up for a singular task. 3 of them emerged, their empty, polished, skull-like faces turned toward the Reliquary. They were the secret maintenance crew, and they approached the massive bone box with a terrifying reverence. Target acquisition, I whispered to Lyra, not moving a muscle. Non-lethal restraint. We need them intact. The servitude of dolls reached the base of the Reliquary. 2 of them stabilized their bodies against the bone casing, while the third, positioned directly over the microscopic access ports, began its work. It carried a collection of syringes, long, thin needles attached to bulbous glass containers. With surgical precision, the servitor located a port, and the process began. A thick, viscous fluid began to flow from the glass container, pumped into the hidden feed line. The fluid was the most visually shocking detail yet. It was a glowing, bright purple nutrient solution, pulsing with its own internal luminescence as it vanished into the bone casing. As the purple nutrient solution was introduced, the rhythmic thump-thump of the heart immediately intensified, growing louder and firmer, and the psychic pressure in the chamber momentarily spiked with renewed vigor. The heart was being fed, and its perpetual suffering was being ensured. That moment of increased activity was my cue. Lyra, execute. The interrogator moved with terrifying speed. Her black armor shed its stillness, and she shot forward, utilizing specialized electro-restraints that snapped around the waists of the 3 diminutive figures before they could register our presence. The servitors went rigid instantly, collapsing in place, their syringes clattering harmlessly against the marble floor. The residual glowing purple nutrient fluid stained the pristine white stone, an ugly splash of synthetic life in the sacred vault. I approached the immobilized figures, my mind already racing through the implications. The fluid traces back to the cardinal, and the servitors are small enough to utilize the tight ducts, a perfect clandestine operation. I knelt beside the nearest figure, peering into its vacant, doll-like face. It was utterly silent, but the sight of its captured body confirmed my gravest fears. This entire operation was run by the ecclesiarchy, hidden in plain sight, ensuring the continuous, specialized agony of the heart to maintain the planet's fragile peace. I collected a sample of the spilled nutrient fluid with a sterile syringe. "The trail is clear, Interrogator," I stated, standing. "We now know how they maintain the Reliquary. It is time to find out who signs the requisition orders for the purple blood." The vault hummed with renewed psychic tension, but my mind was focused on the two samples on the sterile workbench: the captive, rigid servitors, and the vial of glowing purple nutrient fluid. The servitude of dolls had performed their task, but in doing so, they had given me the trail of supply. Analyze the fluid's biosignature. "Lyra," I commanded, holding the syringe of purple solution up to the bone-white light. "Cross-reference against local mini-storeroom supply logs and the Cardinal's personal consumption manifests." Lyra's sensors were already whirring. The fluid was a complex cocktail, designed for maximum efficiency, high glucose content, artificial life stabilizers, and the crucial psychoreactive agent intended to suppress decay and enhance the heart's neural output. It was expensive, specialized, and could not be manufactured locally without high-level clearance. The data returned in a flash across my display, a perfect match. The nutrient fluid was synthesized in a specific, hidden laboratory complex on the administrative level, a complex that, according to the schematics Lyra had seized, sat adjacent to Cardinal Xanthus's personal quarters. "The Cardinal's protocol," I whispered, the name of the chapter clicking into place. "He oversees the operation personally." The realization was a deep, bitter satisfaction. The glazed eyes, the rigid certainty, the refusal to allow access. It wasn't just zealous secrecy. It was proprietary control over the most powerful resource on Pietas Tertius. I directed Lyra to interface with the captured servitors' internal logs. Their purpose was simple, their memories limited, but their programming was absolute. Inject the nutrient solution at specific temporal intervals, then return to the purification bath in the administrative wing. The true horror, however, lay in the fluid's destination. The synthesis laboratory wasn't merely near the Cardinal's residence. The lab's exhaust and waste system fed into the same purification bath that cleansed the servitors. And that bath, the logs indicated, was periodically emptied directly into the cathedral's public incense burners. The faithful breathed the effluence of this atrocity, I realized. The full circle of the corruption slamming into me, the artificial sanctity, the clean air, the cold piety I had sensed upon arrival. It was all a subtle chemical byproduct of the heart's perpetual agony. The worshippers were literally inhaling the purified fumes of perpetual human suffering, which was reinforcing their unnatural zeal. This was the ecclesiarchy at its darkest, a self-sustaining cycle of control, using a controlled horror to reinforce devotion. The Reliquary was not a shrine. It was a localized, controlled chaos sink, an atrocity of human sacrifice that prevented the greater atrocity of demonic incursion. I ordered Lyra to shut down the servitors and store them. They were merely tools. The target was the Cardinal's data core. We had confirmation of the method. Now we needed the motive, the root cause that justified this unholy protocol. "We return to the administrative level, Lyra," I commanded, already moving back toward the vault door. "The Cardinal has locked down the surface data, but the servitors have given us the back door." My boot steps echoed on the clean ceramite, the sound mixing with the steady, dull thump-thump of the heart. The logic was now tragically clear. The Cardinal was fighting the warp with a controlled, contained act of terror. He wasn't a heretic in the traditional sense. He was a desperate pragmatist. And I, as the Inquisitor, was now walking into the most profound moral dilemma of my career. The entire planet was stable because of this terrible lie, and revealing it would likely condemn millions. I needed the full truth before I passed judgment. The journey back up to the administrative level was silent and swift. We moved through maintenance ducts and shadow-draped passages, bypassing the main ceremonial routes. The deeper we climbed, the more the ambient psychic pressure from the Reliquary lessened, but the cold dread of controlled evil intensified. We reached the hidden laboratory adjacent to Cardinal Xanthus's private chambers. It was a sterile, brightly lit space, a pocket of cold imperial science utterly out of place amidst the ancient ecclesiarchy architecture. Vats of the glowing purple, nutrient fluid bubbled softly, and automated distillers hummed, perfecting the psychoreactive components. The source of the poison, I noted, watching Lyra lock down the lab's security and initiate a deep system scan. All this effort, not to save souls, but to sustain suffering. My target was the Cardinal's personal data vault, secured behind 3 layers of cipher-locked adamantium plating. I deployed Lyra. Her purpose was not brute force, but seamless integration. "Interface, interrogator," I commanded. "Find the original protocol, the motive that justified this atrocity 5 centuries ago." Lyra extended a specialized multi-pin, fiber-optic cable from her forearm, effortlessly piercing the exterior shielding. Her single lens went dark, signifying her direct immersion in the data stream. The air filled with a faint, high-pitched static, the sound of machine intelligence fighting through encryption protocols laid down by desperate men 500 years ago. The weight felt eternal, punctuated only by the soft thump-thump that faintly echoed even here. Then, a shudder ran through Lyra's segmented armor, a rare physical response indicating she had hit the core. The data spilled onto my helm display. Not devotional texts, but ancient geological and astronomical logs, the black secret of Pietas Tertius. The logs detailed the planet's history, not as a pristine shrine world, but as a system built directly upon a permanent, subtle warp rift. 5 centuries prior, the rift had destabilized, threatening to turn the entire planet into a demonic playground, a horror far worse than Exterminatus. I scrolled through the desperate deliberations of the original Cardinal engineer. The Magos did not propose orbital bombardment. They proposed stabilization. They chose functional heresy over total obliteration. The text was dry, technical, and utterly terrifying. They calculated the required psychic energy output to generate a containment field large enough to seal the rift. And the only sustainable source was continuous, controlled biological suffering. They didn't just contain a threat. They built an engine of necessary evil, cloaked it in piety, and demanded perpetual sacrifice to maintain the lie. The beating heart was not a punishment, but a terrible, life-saving necessity. "A choice between 2 hells, Lyra," I stated, the data burning in my mind. "Containment or annihilation." The Inquisition would have chosen Exterminatus. They chose to damn their own souls for 500 years of peace. Lyra retracted the cable, her lens glowing again. The static ceased. The black secret was exposed. The Reliquary was not an act of corruption, but an act of desperate salvation. I turned toward the Cardinal's quarters, the weight of the truth heavier than all the adamantium in the vault. I now understood the Cardinal's glazed zeal. It wasn't devotion to the Emperor, but absolute, terrified commitment to the horrifying protocol. He wasn't the heretic. He was the martyr upholding the most terrible lie in the subsector. I had arrived seeking heresy to purge. I had found tragedy to conceal. And now I had to choose. Destroy the mechanism and doom the planet, or maintain the secret and betray every oath I had ever sworn to the Golden Throne. The true judgment was not for the Cardinal, but for me. The cool, sterile air of the Cardinal's laboratory felt suddenly hot, poisoned by the truth I held in my hands. The data logs had delivered the final, crushing calculation. The Reliquary was not a heretical whim, but a functional necessity. I stood amidst the bubbling vats of purple nutrient fluid, my mind reeling. The calculus of the Imperium was simple. The Emperor demands stability. The methods are irrelevant. Here the methods were abhorrent, but the result was peace for 500 years. They chose the greater good, Lyra. I stated, the phrase tasting like ash. They chose to damn their own souls by maintaining a continuous engine of suffering to save millions from the immediate. Total horror of the warp. My oath, sworn on the bones of 10,000 martyrs, commanded me to purge all forms of heresy. This living machine, the heart fueled by purified anguish, The shell built of calcified bone was the physical embodiment of a functional heresy, a continuous act of unholy maintenance that mocked the imperial creed. But the data also contained the counter-argument, stamped with chilling finality. Destabilization of the containment field will result in catastrophic, near-instantaneous warp incursion estimated T-4 hours. I had two choices, neither of which aligned with the purity of my duty: purge the heresy, destroy the Reliquary, expose the Cardinal, and report the atrocity. Consequence: Pietas Tertius would be lost within the day, millions of loyal citizens butchered or demonically corrupted. I would save my soul but doom a world, maintain the lie, destroy the data, silence the Cardinal, or join him, and allow the nightmare to continue. Consequence: Pietas Tertius remains safe, the lie stands, and I become a direct accessory to perpetual human sacrifice. I would doom my soul but save a world. This was the true horror, not the demon, but the moral arithmetic of survival in the 41st millennium. The Inquisition was founded to make these impossible choices, but never had the necessity been so tragically clear. I turned my attention to the access plate leading to the Cardinal's chamber. I had not killed him yet. I needed to understand the mindset that could uphold this cult of necessity. But as I reached for the handle, a klaxon blared from the adjacent administrative corridor. Not a security breach, but a general mobilization alert. The shrill, insistent sound cut through the oppressive calm of the sub-levels. "Lyra, report," I snapped, drawing my bolt pistol. Her lens flickered. "Warning, Inquisitor's presence detected. Sub-level quarantine initiated. Movement detected. 3 squads, high-density Ministorum militia." The Cardinal had been too quiet. My decision to capture the servitors instead of eliminating them had been a misstep. The moment the maintenance servitude failed to return to their purification bath, Xantus knew his protocol was compromised. "He chose the lie," I murmured, my grip tightening on the pistol, "and he intends to protect it with martyrdom." The faint, rhythmic thump-thump of the Reliquary's heart seemed to slow infinitesimally under the sudden seismic stress of the militia's rapid approach. The air around us, so unnaturally still moments ago, now hummed with the electric static of approaching zealotry. I was no longer just dealing with a moral dilemma. I was now locked in a desperate firefight, trapped between an overwhelming wave of fanatic loyalists and a ticking time bomb of pure chaos. The time for moral reflection was over. The time for brutal pragmatic action had begun. We were trapped between the two hells. The klaxon's shriek was a betrayal, a raw electronic sound that shredded the quiet of the administrative sub-level. The time for moral contemplation was violently over. 3 squads, I repeated, confirming Lyra's data on my display. Frateris militia. They're coming from the main supply corridor. I shoved the vial of purple nutrient fluid into a shielded pocket of my armor. The data logs were secured, but the tangible evidence, the lifeblood of the atrocity, was necessary for my eventual report. We slammed the steel door of the lab, Lyra welding the seams shut with a focused burst of plasma from her gauntlet. It wouldn't hold the Ministorum militia for long, but it bought us precious seconds to choose our final battlefield. The Cardinal anticipated my return to the surface, I analyzed, moving quickly to a small maintenance access grate. He's banking on the fanaticism of his guards to cleanse the area. We are the heretics, disrupting his divine protection. We scrambled down the narrow vertical shaft used by the Servitude of Dolls, a passage too tight for the bulk of the militia. We emerged into the wide granite tunnel of Chapter 4, the very one leading to the Reliquary vault. The air here was vibrating, not just with the steady thump-thump of the heart, but with the thunder of power boots and the rising cadence of a furious chant. The militia was here. They poured around the corner of the tunnel, a wall of zealous fury. 40 men in heavy, tarnished armor, carrying chain axes and galvanic rifles. Their eyes, visible through the slits of their helms, burned with the same terrifying glazed fervor as the Cardinal's. They were utterly convinced I was a demon-sent disruptor. For the purity of Pietas, their officer screamed, and the volley of galvanic fire instantly lit the tunnel, the air crackling with energy. Lyra reacted instantly, throwing a photon flashbang that detonated in the militia's formation. It bought us a moment of blindness, but not silence. We pressed ourselves against the stone wall, the air filled with the deafening thunder of close-quarters combat in a confined space. "Lyra, prioritize the officer," I shouted, firing my bolt pistol. The rounds impacted the militia armor with heavy thuds, sending splinters of ceramite and blood spraying. The problem was their zeal. The Frateris militia were not trained soldiers, but fanatics powered by absolute, unshakable belief. They charged blindly through the disorientation, their axes singing against the granite walls, and then the Reliquary itself reacted. The seismic stress of the heavy combat, the explosions, the charging boots, the galvanic fire had affected the delicate psychic balance of the vault. The rhythmic thump-thump faltered, replaced by an erratic, agonizing stutter. My helm's auspex immediately flashed a critical warning. The containment field integrity was dropping rapidly, and the spectral analysis showed a massive, restless buildup of energy at the core. "The containment is dropping, Lyra. We have minutes," I roared, knowing the urgency was mortal. I ducked under a swinging chain axe, driving my elbow into the zealot's jaw. As he collapsed, I saw a terrifying sight on Lyra's secondary screen. The projected image of the warp rift beneath the Reliquary, which was beginning to pulse with an active, hungry red light. I realized the full, crushing extent of my failure. I hadn't just discovered the necessary evil. I had actively destabilized it by forcing the Cardinal's hand. I was the agent of the very doom the Reliquary was created to prevent. "New objective, Lyra," I commanded, aiming a blast at a fanatic attempting to flank us. "Bypass the militia. We are breaching the vault, but not to study the relic. We are going to destroy the infrastructure feeding the heart. We must overload the system and neutralize the rift's anchor." The fate of Pietas Tertius now rested on a final, desperate act. Using the planet's own power to commit immediate total destruction, the final, most extreme purge. The tunnel had devolved into a cacophony of zealotry and suppressed terror. The Ministorum militia were not backing down. Their galvanic rifles spat bursts of energy that chipped and scorched the granite, while their fanatic officer bellowed verses of condemnation. I leveraged the structure's flaws. The Ministorum built its halls wide for ceremony, but I fought in the shadows. I fired a precise sequence of 3 bolt rounds into the lead militia officer's chest plate. The rounds failed to pierce the heavy armor, but impacted with enough kinetic force to shatter his sternum and silence his chanting. The militia's advance faltered, not out of fear, but confusion. "Lyra, secure the rear flank. Redirect all fire onto the support column." Lyra was a whirlwind of practiced violence. Her plasma gauntlet, a concealed tool of surgical destruction, now became a weapon of pure denial. She swept a focused beam along the base of a massive support pillar, turning adamantium to molten slag. The pillar groaned, and the ceiling above the militia cracked ominously. They hesitated, caught between their fear of collapse and their blind fury. But the real threat wasn't the militia. It was the Reliquary. The rhythmic thump-thump had not just faltered. It had become a frantic, agonizing thump-stutter-thump-stop. The psychic containment field, damaged by the seismic shock of the blast, was collapsing. My helm display turned blood red with multiple critical warnings. Lyra's auspex was screaming, showing the active warp rift building pressure beneath the vault floor. Then, the final undeniable signal. The Reliquary's facade cracked, a fissure, dark and deep, snaked down the bone-white marble casing of the gigantic box. And from that crack, a plume of raw, hot warp air escaped. It wasn't steam or smoke. It was a visible exhalation of the other. The plume carried a smell of ozone, sulfur, and ancient terror. The raw essence of the Eye of Terror, now bleeding into the air of Pietas Tertius. The moment the warp breath touched the sterile granite floor, the air filled with faint, unintelligible whispers and psychic static, a million silent mouths attempting to speak through the crack. The militia saw it. The sight of the unholy vapor escaping the sacred container should have broken their minds, but instead it merely redoubled their zeal. Heresy. The Inquisitor has opened the darkness. The remaining militia screamed, abandoning all tactical formation and charging toward the vault door, ready to die defending the relic. I glanced at the crack, then at the access point leading up to the main power conduits. The heart was failing, the rift was growing restless. The choice was no longer abstract or moral. It was purely mechanical. The relic was too strong to be destroyed by conventional weapons. The entire massive infrastructure of the containment field had to be used against itself. The only way to stop the rift was to obliterate the heart's sustaining infrastructure, the functional heresy, with a massive surge of power. Lyra, tactical withdrawal, I commanded, pulling back from the raging militia. We are leaving the vault perimeter. New priority, power junction Delta 9 in the main utility shafts, 3 levels above us. The militia, however, were on us. 2 chain axes swung from my head. I parried one with my pistol guard and slammed a specialized stub carbine round into the skull of the other zealot. The fighting was messy, close and desperate. I knew I was leaving the relic in the hands of the very fanatics who would die to protect it. But the Reliquary wasn't the threat anymore. The imminent warp breach was. I had to choose the ultimate form of purge. Prepare for a diversion, interrogator, I grunted, reloading my pistol as we retreated into the maintenance duct. I looked at Lyra, her single lens staring back at me with unblinking loyalty. I knew what I was about to ask of her. The time for martyrdom is now, Lyra, I stated, the grim truth hanging heavy between us. But it will be a martyrdom of necessity, not glory. We must sacrifice the last shred of our anonymity to save the surface. The retreat up the narrow servitor duct was a desperate, choking climb. We left the militia raging below, their curses and the clang of their chain axes echoing against the frantic, a rhythmic thudding of the dying heart. We burst out into the wider maintenance shaft, the air here heavy with electrical ozone and the rising sulfurous scent of the warp breach. Power junction Delta 9 was only 200 meters away, a colossal hub where the planet's power grid converged before distribution. Lyra, we have no time for conventional explosives, I rasped, leaning against the cold conduit wall, fighting for breath. The militia will catch us before I can breach the junction's shielding. We need a massive localized overload now. Lyra stood beside me, utterly motionless. Her internal chronometer showed we had less than 3 minutes before the containment field dropped completely. We both knew the next step was a one-way trip for the interrogator. I reached out, placing my gauntleted hand on the cool, segmented armor of her shoulder. This was the true moment of betrayal, not against the ecclesiarchy, but against the partner who had silently served me for decades. Her advanced cybernetic systems, her plasma gauntlet, her fusion core, they were a priceless resource, and I was about to order her to turn them into a sacrificial bomb. Lyra, I commanded, my voice flat, holding the immense authority of my office, masking the profound cold guilt. Protocol 6 Alpha, localized self-destruct. Initiate massive overload of the plasma gauntlet and fusion core. Target the conduit we just left. Set the burst to maximum destabilization, prioritizing electromagnetic pulse and heat dispersal. We need 20 seconds of chaos. Lyra's helm lens, the single window into her intelligence, flared briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the order. She did not argue or hesitate. Her programming was absolute. Execute the will of the Inquisitor. She turned back toward the narrow duct entrance. Her posture changed from sentinel to weapon. She drove the fingers of her free hand into the granite wall, anchoring her body against the recoil that was coming. Go. Lord Inquisitor, her synthesized voice stated, a clinical, emotionless sound that nonetheless carried the weight of a final farewell. I will grant you the assent. I didn't waste the moment with meaningless words of thanks or regret. I simply nodded, the grim acceptance of her fate mirroring my own inevitable doom. Her life, her function, her very being, all were now a component in my desperate calculus of survival. I turned and ran, sprinting toward the massive humming power junction Delta 9. Behind me, The execution began. A high-pitched, resonant whine built up inside Lyra's frame, the sound of her fusion core being deliberately overloaded. The ambient light dimmed as she drew immense power from the local conduits to amplify the blast. I heard the sound of the charging militia pouring out of the servitor duct behind her. They saw her, a lone figure standing guard, and paused for only a split second before beginning their final charge. Then, she fired. It was not a directed plasma beam. It was a massive, uncontrolled detonation. Lyra released the entire overloaded charge of her gauntlet and core into the tight confines of the tunnel opening. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. A thunderous roar shook the entire sublevel. A huge, blinding, white-hot plume of plasma and electromagnetic energy erupted from the narrow duct, instantly vaporizing the granite, the militia, and Lyra herself. The blast was accompanied by a localized electromagnetic pulse, EMP, that slammed into the surrounding conduits, extinguishing every light source for hundreds of meters and bathing the area in total darkness. The entire segment of the sublevel went silent, replaced by the ringing echo of the explosion and the stench of burnt ozone and fused metal. I stumbled in the sudden darkness, shielded only by the solid adamantium mass of the main power conduit I was now hugging. Lyra was gone. Her sacrifice had bought me exactly what I needed, a path to the junction, 20 seconds of absolute chaos, and a single, crippling blow against the militia. I activated the low-frequency light on my helm. The power junction loomed ahead. I had my window, but the silence that followed the blast was immediately filled by a sound far worse than the militia's screams, the roaring sound of the warp itself. The rhythmic heartbeat had died, and the rift was actively pushing through the final, shattered defenses of the Reliquary vault below. The time for destruction was now. The silence of Lyra's martyrdom was short-lived. The electromagnetic pulse had fried the primary lighting system in this sector, plunging the corridor into a darkness thick enough to chew. My helm's low-frequency illumination was the only beacon, cutting a cold surgical cone through the shadows. But the darkness wasn't empty. It was filled with the raw, acoustic sound of the warp. The rhythmic thump of the heart was gone, replaced by a deep, hungry, gurgling roar emanating from the vault below. The air grew instantly hotter, humid, and heavy with the scent of sulfur and corrosive ozone, the unmistakable rift's breath. I sprinted toward Power Junction Delta 9, a colossal junction box reinforced with layers of ceramite and adamantium plating, humming with the power of 1,000,000 souls. The junction itself was a towering Gothic monstrosity of fused metal and conduits, perfectly shielded against all conventional threats. My body was screaming. The loss of Lyra, the adrenaline of the firefight, and the sudden, overwhelming psychic pressure from the breached containment field were pushing me past my physical limits. The hair on my arm stood on end, a warning that the warp was actively seeking purchase in the physical world. I reached the junction, slamming my hand onto the cool, dense plating. The structure was magnificent, designed to route the planet's entire power output with absolute reliability. I quickly deployed my demolition kit, specialized microsaws and macro spikers, tools intended for neutralizing heretical power cores, not committing planetary sabotage. My goal was simple: destroy the functional heresy by feeding it with the very energy it was supposed to regulate. The original protocol sustained the heart with a trickle of specialized energy. To purge the rift's anchor, I needed to reroute the junction's entire massive output, pure, unrefined plasma energy, directly into the remnants of the Reliquary's shattered sustaining circuit. I began the grueling work of peeling back the ceramite shielding, the whine of my microsaws agonizingly loud in the oppressive silence. Crack. The sound came from the servitor duct Lyra had just immolated. A terrifying, wet, dragging sound, followed by a muffled cough. A few of the militia had survived the EMP and the thermal blast, their armor now fused and blackened, but their zealous fury undimmed. The Inquisitor. He flees. He cannot escape the judgment of the throne. A voice gargled, distorted by a damaged vox grill. 3 figures, grotesque shadows in the gloom, their arms melted to their weapons, began dragging themselves toward me. They weren't a threat to my life, but a fatal obstacle to my task. Every second they delayed me was a second gained by the growing warp rift below. I ignored them, focusing on the junction. My micro saws hit the final layer of adamantium. I needed to access the primary bus bars, the main power conduits. As I worked, the sound from below escalated. The granite floor beneath my boots began to tremor violently. The gurgling roar was louder, and now a sound like glass shattering, the final, total destruction of the Reliquary's containment field. My helm display flashed a final, terrifying warning. Rift breach imminent. Estimated time to incursion, T-90 seconds. I tossed the saws aside and grabbed my heaviest tool, the macro spiker. This device, a reinforced energy tap designed for planetary sabotage, was my only hope. I had to plunge it into the main conduit and set the overload sequence manually. The 3 surviving zealots were upon me. One grabbed my leg. I didn't turn. I simply stomped down with my boot heel, crushing the ruined hand that gripped me. "Your piety is futile," I shouted into the darkness, not to them, but to the system I was about to destroy. "The only way to save your world is to purge your lie." I found the target conduit, a cable as thick as my torso, pulsating with raw, untamed power. I slammed the macro spiker home, sinking the massive spike into the conduit's core. The power surge was instantaneous. The junction box shrieked in protest, sparks the size of my fist raining down in the darkness. I grabbed the final control pad and began inputting the override codes, the fatal sequence that would channel a planet's life-giving energy into a single point of absolute annihilation. The true purge was underway. The junction box shrieked around me, a cacophony of failing Imperial systems. I had spiked the primary conduit, and now the process of annihilation was irreversible. The macro spiker was locked in, pumping the raw, unrefined plasma energy of Pietas Tertius directly toward the shattered reliquary vault below. I ripped my hand away from the control pad, the excess energy leaving scorch marks on my glove. My mission was complete. The self-destruct sequence was running. Now I only had to survive the consequences long enough to report the truth. I turned to flee the junction, scrambling onto the nearest vertical maintenance ladder. Below me, the tunnel floor was an apocalyptic scene. Flickering emergency lumens had kicked back on, casting stark red light onto the carnage. Fused metal, vaporized granite, and the smoking remains of Lyra's martyrdom marked the site of the EMP blast. The 3 surviving zealots were moving again. They were crawling, dragging themselves over the debris, their limbs twisted and their armor blackened. But their faces, what remained of them, were alight with a final desperate, terrifying fanaticism. "Heretic! Traitor! You shall not leave the throne's world!" One of them shrieked, the sound a ragged wheeze. I didn't waste ammunition. I began my ascent, climbing into the cramped, ancient utility shafts that led up toward the surface and the nearest auxiliary landing zone. The air around me was thickening. The sulphurous, heavy heat of the rift's breath was now pouring up the main shafts, actively pushing through the conduits. It was no longer a subtle smell. It was a hot, corrosive wind. As I climbed, the warp static intensified. My helm's audio system, usually pristine, began filling with whispers and psychic static. They were faint, sibilant sounds, not words I could understand, but raw malice, the babbling hunger of demons sensing a sudden massive breach. The integrity of the shafts was failing. The excess energy draining through the system was causing secondary explosions. Pipes burst, spraying coolant. Conduits overloaded with loud, explosive cracks. I glanced down. The zealots were still climbing, somehow fueled by pure, final hatred. The warp-infused air was beginning to affect my perception. The ladder rungs seemed to writhe. The shadows stretched into grotesque, non-Euclidean shapes, and the whispers began coalescing into recognizable, taunting sounds of my failures. The very infrastructure of the shaft was becoming hostile, reflecting the imminent chaos incursion. Don't look down. Don't listen to the walls. I repeated the mantra of the Ordo Malleus, focusing solely on the feel of the cold, hard rungs beneath my gloves. I forced myself into a punishing pace. Every muscle screamed, and the wounds from the earlier firefight flared. But the alternative was unthinkable, being caught here, trapped between the crushing judgment of the surviving fanatics and the terrifying, liquid horror of the fully manifested warp rift. Finally, I reached the service level, the threshold between the hidden infrastructure and the public face of the cathedral. I used my boot to kick out the access panel, spilling onto the floor of a narrow, dusty crawl space. I paused only for a breath, tasting the clean, sweet air of the surface filtering through the ducts. The false sanctity that was about to be obliterated by the raw power I had unleashed. I had minutes before the surge found its target below. I had to transmit the truth, the core of the functional heresy, before the catastrophic detonation destroyed the planet's comms systems entirely. The climb was over. The transmission was next. The final act of defiance against a system that demanded a necessary lie was about to begin. I burst from the crawl space, fueled by adrenaline and the corrosive stench of the warp rising behind me. I was in a vast, dusty service plenum, a silent, high-vaulted space meant only for maintenance drones and tech priests, its atmosphere still sweet with the false sanctity of the surface. My eyes immediately located my target, a high-gain, heavily shielded macrovox array mounted to the far wall. This system was designed to transmit planetary reports directly to the Segmentum Command, and its shielding would survive the localized overload I had initiated. I staggered toward it, my armor scorched and my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The floor beneath my feet was vibrating violently, and I could hear the immense, agonizing sound of fusing metal from the utility shafts below. The sound of the core energy consuming the very conduits it flowed through. I ripped the access panel off the Vox array. The internal components were complex but familiar. I didn't need to send a lengthy report. The truth, however complex the calculus, had to be condensed into a single, devastating transmission. I pulled out the tiny, shielded data slate containing the Cardinal's full logs. I needed to transmit the core data, the coordinates of the permanent warp rift, and the chemical analysis of the psycho-reactive nutrient fluid before the system died. I ignored the screaming static flooding my audio feed, plunged the macrospiker cable into the array's data port, and began the forced upload. The upload was agonizingly slow. The planetary systems were in chaos, fighting the surge. I stood guard over the array, my bolt pistol resting on the console, waiting for the inevitable blast. Suddenly, a voice cut through the static, raw and close. "Inquisitor!" I spun around. Standing at the entrance to the plenum, framed against the faint red glow bleeding from the lower shafts, was the Cardinal Xantus. He was alone, his robes torn and covered in dust, but his gaze was still utterly fixed, his eyes burning with a final, desperate zeal. "You have destroyed us. You have breached the Covenant," Xantus shrieked, his voice cracking with monumental despair. 500 years of stability, sacrificed for purity? The Emperor demands function, not piety. He advanced slowly, his skeletal hand clutching a heavy, ancient reliquary mace. "Your crime," he wheezed, "is that you chose a glorious death over a necessary life." I didn't argue. He spoke the truth of his pragmatic nightmare. "And your crime, Cardinal," I countered, raising my pistol, "was daring to sanction the nightmare. I choose neither the life nor the death. I choose the record." The Vox array flashed green. Upload complete. I grabbed the control pad and rapidly typed the final message, the one that would damn me and save the sector. Inquisitor VAR status. Critical. Location. Pietas Tertius. Threat. Widespread catastrophic rift breach imminent. T0. Cause. Destruction of. Containment device. The Reliquary. Addendum. The Reliquary was a functional heresy, Necessary, stabilized, permanent rift. Containment required perpetual human sacrifice. Judgment. Functional heresy was the lesser evil. Action. Forced system overload initiated purge. Complete. Sending full data packet. Final note. Inform the Ordos that the Imperium committed evil to survive. Hit the transmit button. The Vox array shuddered, pumping the final packet of data, the coordinates, the chemical analyses, and my self-condemning judgment out into the void. A grim whisper of truth that would shatter the facade of Pietas Tertius. A blinding red flash erupted from the maintenance shafts below, followed by a roar that was no longer gurgling warp, but the sound of an entire planetary power grid detonating at a single point. The total destruction of the Reliquary vault. The ground bucked violently, the ceiling of the plenum cracked, and dust rained down in thick sheets. I fired a final precise bolt round into the center mass of the charging cardinal, silencing his righteous zeal forever. I had minutes. The surface was about to become an inferno. My transmission was out. Now escape. The detonation was deafening. The floor of the service plenum lunged upward, throwing me violently against the Vox array. The force wasn't a clean blast, but a seismic shudder. The entire weight of the cathedral's substructure shifting as the void beneath it was violently purged. I dragged myself away from the wreckage, my armor cracked and my head ringing. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of ozone, but the corrosive, sulfurous scent of the warp was, astonishingly, receding. The massive surge of raw plasma energy had obliterated the functional heresy and critically neutralized the permanent warp rift beneath Pietas Tertius. The core of the problem was gone. I didn't pause for relief. I scrambled toward the shattered emergency maintenance hatch, using the last of my strength to kick the fused metal aside. I hauled myself into the vertical access duct, climbing away from the impending collapse of the administrative wing. When I finally broke through onto the surface level, it was to a scene of controlled pandemonium. Sirens wailed across the precinct. Smoke billowed from the foundations of the Cathedral of the Divine Ascent, which was now visibly listing, its grand facade cracking under the internal stress. The gleaming white marble was streaked with dark lines of debris and fluid, resembling tears. I ignored the panic of the scattered citizens and the rallying cries of the Ministorum Guard. My priority was the auxiliary shuttle bay, the pre-arranged extraction point of the Oathbound. I reached the bay just as my pilot, a grizzled and silent man named Serkon, was lowering the ramp. He took one look at my smoke-blackened armor and shattered demeanor and knew enough not to ask questions. We lifted off barely seconds before the cathedral's central spire, stressed beyond its limits, groaned one final time and collapsed into the main dome with a sound that shook the very atmosphere. Pietas Tertius had survived, but its greatest lie had been violently exposed. Aboard the Oathbound, floating safely in the void, I accessed the final data streams. Serkon worked silently, stabilizing my life support and patching my comms array. The local systems were a mess, but my final transmission, the one containing the coordinates, the chemical analyses, and my terrible judgment, had punched through the planetary interference and was already confirmed received by Segmentum Command. I did not celebrate. I did not mourn Lyra. I simply stared at the final, simple truth displayed on my screen. The rhythmic thump was gone. The heartbeat of perpetual suffering had been extinguished. But the silence that replaced it was the heaviest burden of all. I looked down at the jewel of a planet, now scarred by a vast, smoking hole. I had fulfilled my purpose. The immediate threat of demonic incursion was gone, and the terrible truth of the functional heresy was on its way to the highest echelons of the Ordos. My fate was sealed. My judgment was inevitable. The Ordos Hereticus would recognize the technical brilliance of my solution, but would condemn the violation of fundamental imperial law. I had admitted to endorsing an act of sustained human sacrifice, even if it was the lesser evil, and then destroyed the evidence in a blaze of unauthorized planetary destruction. I was now a fugitive, a pariah, carrying a truth too ugly for the Imperium to swallow without violence. I had come seeking heresy to purge. I left having committed a crime to ensure survival. My only comfort was the cold, hard logic learned in the vault. The Imperium must commit evil to survive. I was now one of the necessary evils, forever marked by the scars of the broken Aquila, knowing that somewhere, in the shadowed chambers of the High Lords of Terror, a decision would be made to conceal my truth and build a new reliquary somewhere else, one day. My hand, resting on the silent console, trembled slightly. The metallic taste of bitter knowledge was all that remained. The silence was the sound of a world saved, but the judgment was yet to come.